The Historical Society in Salem, Massachusetts was quiet on the October morning Dr. Rachel Morgan arrived to examine a recently donated collection of documents. Rachel was a medical historian specializing in folk medicine and healing practices in colonial America. She'd driven up from Boston after receiving an urgent call from the Society's director. "Dr. Morgan, we've received a donation from an estate in Virginia, papers that have been in the family for generations. There's something in here about a slave woman in the 1740s who was accused of witchcraft. The case seems unusual. We thought you might be interested." Rachel had researched dozens of witchcraft accusations during the colonial period. Most followed predictable patterns: women who were too independent, too outspoken, or too skilled at healing being accused when something went wrong in the community. But when the director showed her the documents, Rachel felt her breath catch. The papers were remarkably well preserved, wrapped in oilcloth and stored in a wooden chest. There were court records, personal letters, witness testimonies, and something Rachel had never seen before, detailed medical case notes written by the accused woman herself. The woman's name was Dinah. No last name recorded, just Dinah, enslaved by a merchant family named Thornton in Williamsburg, Virginia in 1743. According to the court records, she'd been accused of witchcraft after healing 33 people of various ailments over the course of 2 years. The accusations came not because her patients died, but because they lived, healed so completely that townspeople believed she was using dark magic. Rachel began reading the trial transcript, dated November 1743. Testimony of Reverend Josiah Blackwood: "I witnessed the slave woman Dinah treat young Thomas Carpenter, who had been afflicted with a fever that 3 physicians said would kill him. The boy was near death. Dinah gave him strange teas and poultices, whispered words in a heathen tongue, and within 3 days the boy was recovered. No Christian medicine could work so quickly. It can only be the devil's work." Testimony of Magistrate William Fletcher: "The slave woman has healed 33 people in this town, 33. She heals wounds that should fester. She cures fevers that should kill. She treats ailments that trained physicians cannot cure. This is not natural skill. This is witchcraft, plain as day. She must be examined and, if found guilty, burned as the law requires." Rachel's hands trembled as she continued reading. The trial had lasted 3 days. Witness after witness testified about Dinah's healing abilities. Some spoke with gratitude: she'd saved their children, their spouses, their parents. Others spoke with fear: no slave woman should possess such knowledge, such power. It wasn't natural. It wasn't Christian. It must be witchcraft. But what shocked Rachel most was what came next: Dinah's own testimony, recorded by a court clerk. "I am no witch. I am a healer, taught by my grandmother who was taught by her grandmother, back to the old country across the ocean. The plants speak to me of their properties. The body speaks to me of its ailments. I see what is wrong and I know what will heal. This is not magic. This is knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge older than this colony, older than your churches. You call it witchcraft because you do not understand it. But I have saved your children. I have healed your sick. I have harmed no one. If this is evil, then your God is cruel indeed." The court had found her guilty. The sentence was death by burning, to be carried out on December 1, 1743. According to the records, a pyre had been built in the town square. Dinah had been brought out in chains before a crowd of hundreds. The torch was lit. And then something impossible happened. Rachel read the final document, a letter written by Magistrate Fletcher to the Governor of Virginia, dated December 5, 1743. "Your Excellency, I write to inform you of a most disturbing occurrence in Williamsburg. On December 1, as planned, we gathered to execute the slave woman Dinah, convicted of witchcraft. She was bound to the stake. The pyre was lit. The flames began to rise. And then, in front of over 300 witnesses, she vanished. One moment she was there, visible in the flames, and the next moment she was simply gone. Not burned, gone. Disappeared as if she had never been there at all. The ropes that had bound her fell empty to the ground. The chains lay open, unbroken. It was as if she had passed through them like smoke. The crowd panicked. Many fled, screaming of demons and dark magic. Others searched the area, thinking perhaps she had somehow escaped in the confusion. But there was no explanation. The slave woman Dinah had disappeared in front of hundreds of witnesses in a manner that defied all natural law. I do not know what to make of this, Your Excellency. Either we witnessed a genuine supernatural event, or we were all deceived by means I cannot fathom. The Thornton family, who owned the slave, is demanding compensation for their lost property. The townspeople are terrified. The church is calling for investigations into whether more witches walk among us. I await your guidance on how to proceed. Respectfully. Magistrate William Fletcher. Rachel sat back in her chair, her mind racing. A slave woman who healed 33 people. Who was convicted of witchcraft. Who was about to be burned. And who vanished in front of hundreds of witnesses. It was impossible. But it was also documented, court records, witness testimonies, an official letter to the governor. This wasn't folklore or legend. This was recorded history. Rachel spent the next 2 weeks at the Historical Society, going through every document in the collection. She found more details about Dinah's healings, specific cases with names, dates, and descriptions of the ailments treated. There were testimonies from people she'd healed praising her skill and kindness. There were angry denunciations from physicians who'd been made to look incompetent when Dinah succeeded where they'd failed. And there were Dinah's own medical notes, pages and pages of detailed observations about symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. Rachel, with her medical history background, recognized immediately that these weren't the notes of a superstitious folk healer. These were the observations of someone with sophisticated medical knowledge, someone who understood disease processes, herbal pharmacology, and clinical observation in ways that were remarkably advanced for the 1740s. One entry particularly stunned Rachel. Patient, Margaret Sutton, age 47. Symptoms: persistent pain in right lower abdomen, fever, loss of appetite, vomiting. Duration: 3 days, worsening rapidly. Diagnosis: inflammation of the appendix, what the ancient texts call inflammation of the cecum. If not treated, the appendix will rupture and poison will spread through the belly, causing death within days. Treatment: cannot perform surgery, would be accused of murder if I cut her open. Instead, applied cold compresses to reduce inflammation. Gave teas of white willow bark for pain and fever. Gave bitter herbs to reduce appetite and allow the appendix to rest. Instructed family to keep her still and give only water for 3 days. Outcome: after 5 days, fever broke. Pain diminished. Patient recovered fully. I believe the inflammation resolved without rupture. This is the 3rd such case I have treated successfully using this method. The physicians say it is a miracle. I know it is simply understanding what the body needs to heal itself. Rachel's hands shook as she read this. Dinah had diagnosed appendicitis in 1743, over a century before the condition would be formally identified by medical science. She'd treated it successfully using anti-inflammatory methods that modern medicine would recognize as sound. And she documented it all with the precision of a trained physician. But how? Where had an enslaved woman in colonial Virginia acquired such advanced medical knowledge? Rachel found a clue in another document, a letter from a Virginia physician named Dr. Edmund Hartley, written in 1742. I encountered today the most unusual situation. The slave woman Dinah, owned by the Thorntons, came to me seeking to purchase medical texts. She offered me 3 shillings, money I suspect she earned by treating the townspeople, though such work is technically illegal for slaves to perform independently. I asked her why she wanted medical books. She told me she'd been taught healing by her grandmother in Africa, but she wanted to learn what European physicians knew as well. She said, "All knowledge of healing is valuable, whether it comes from my people or yours." I was so astonished by her manner, she spoke like an educated woman, not a slave, that I agreed to lend her some texts. I gave her my old copy of Culpeper's Herbal and a basic anatomy text. I told her to return them when finished. She returned them 3 weeks later, and when I questioned her about the contents, I discovered she had not merely read them but memorized them. She could recite passages verbatim. She could explain anatomical structures and herbal properties with understanding that took me years of study to achieve. I am ashamed to admit this, but I felt threatened by her knowledge. Here was a slave woman who understood medicine as well as I did, perhaps better in some regards. I told her I could lend her no more books. I told her she should not practice healing, as it was not her place. She looked at me with such sadness and said, "People are suffering. I can help them. How is it wrong to heal?" I had no answer that did not sound cruel even to my own ears. Rachel discovered that Dr. Hartley had later testified at Dinah's trial, not in her defense, but as one of her accusers, claiming her knowledge was unnatural and therefore must be demonic. The pattern became clear to Rachel. Dinah had possessed medical knowledge far beyond what anyone expected of an enslaved woman. She'd used that knowledge to heal people effectively. And rather than being celebrated for her skill, she'd been accused of witchcraft because her abilities threatened the established social and medical order. But what about the disappearance? How could that be explained? Rachel found the answer in an unexpected place, a diary kept by a woman named Elizabeth Warren, who'd been one of Dinah's patients. The diary had been included in the donated collection, though it hadn't been catalogued yet. Rachel found it tucked in the bottom of the chest, wrapped in a separate cloth as if someone had wanted to preserve it specially. Elizabeth Warren's entry from December 2, 1743. I witnessed yesterday an event that I shall never forget and can hardly believe, though I saw it with my own eyes. Dinah, the healer who saved my life when I was dying of childbed fever, was sentenced to burn for witchcraft. I attended the execution with a heavy heart, knowing that a good woman was being murdered for the crime of being too skilled. But what happened defied all explanation. As the flames rose, I saw Dinah's face. She was not afraid. She was not praying or pleading. She was smiling, a sad, knowing smile. And then, in an instant, she was gone. I have thought much about what I witnessed. The crowd believes she vanished by magic. The church says it proves she was indeed a witch. But I believe something else occurred. 3 days before her execution, I visited Dinah in her cell. I brought her food and tried to comfort her. She told me not to grieve. She said, "I will not burn. I have friends who will ensure my escape." I thought she meant she expected to be pardoned or that someone would break her out of jail. Now I understand she meant something else entirely. I believe Dinah was rescued, but by such clever means that it appeared supernatural. I believe her friends created a distraction or deception that allowed her to escape in the confusion of the moment. The smoke from the fire, the panic of the crowd, the expectation that she would burn, all of this could have been used to cover a daring rescue. I pray she is safe, wherever she is. And I pray that history will remember her not as a witch, but as a healer who saved many lives and who was persecuted for her kindness. Rachel sat back, thinking through the possibilities. Elizabeth Warren's explanation was logical, an elaborate rescue made to look supernatural. But how could such a rescue have been accomplished? And who were these friends, with the resources and skill to pull off such a deception? Rachel needed to know more. She began researching the historical context of 1740s Virginia, looking for clues about who might have helped Dinah escape. What she found shocked her. In the archives of the Virginia Historical Society in Richmond, Rachel discovered correspondence between Quaker abolitionists in Pennsylvania and sympathetic contacts in Virginia. The Quakers had been opposed to slavery since the late 1600s and had developed underground networks to help enslaved people escape. One letter, dated November 1743, right when Dinah was on trial, mentioned a healer of great skill who needed to be removed from danger before she is lost to us. Another letter, dated January 1744, mentioned that the Virginia friend has been successfully relocated to Philadelphia and is now practicing her healing arts among our community. The letters didn't mention Dinah by name, but the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Rachel traveled to Philadelphia to search Quaker records. And there, in the archives of a Quaker meeting house, she found what she'd been looking for, records of a healer named Sister Dinah, who'd worked in the Philadelphia Quaker community from 1744 until her death in 1789. The records described her as a woman of African descent with remarkable healing abilities, who came to us from Virginia under mysterious circumstances. She has saved countless lives in our community and trains others in her healing methods. There were detailed records of her work, patients treated, apprentices trained, medical innovations documented. Sister Dinah had lived for 46 more years after her supposed execution, healing people and teaching others her methods. But the most extraordinary discovery was a letter Dinah herself had written to the Philadelphia Quaker community in 1750, 7 years after her escape. In it, she finally explained what had really happened. My friends, you have asked me many times to tell the story of how I came to be among you, how I escaped the fire that was meant to consume me. I have been reluctant to speak of it, fearing that the truth might endanger those who helped me. But 7 years have passed, and I am now far from Virginia and its power. I will tell you the truth, so that you may understand what your kindness and courage accomplished. I was indeed bound to the stake. I was indeed surrounded by fire. But what the crowd did not know was that my bonds had been secretly weakened by friends who visited me the night before. What they did not know was that beneath my dress I wore clothes prepared for travel. What they did not know was that in the crowd stood 3 men ready to create confusion and cover my escape. When the fire was lit and smoke began to rise, these brave men threw powders into the flames that created thick black smoke, smoke that obscured the view of the crowd. In that moment of confusion, I slipped my weakened bonds, shed my outer dress, and dropped through a hollow space beneath the pyre that had been dug the night before. I crawled through this tunnel to a waiting wagon hidden just beyond the square. By the time the smoke cleared, I was gone. The crowd believed they had witnessed magic. But it was not magic, it was courage, planning, and the kindness of people who believed that burning a healer was a greater evil than breaking the law. I do not know the names of all who helped me. The Quaker friends who coordinated my rescue kept such secrets to protect everyone involved. But I know I owe my life to people who valued justice over law, who valued life over property. I healed 33 people in Virginia. I have now healed hundreds here in Philadelphia. I train others in healing so that this knowledge will not die with me. This is how I honor those who saved me, by saving others, by passing on knowledge, by ensuring that healing continues. I was called a witch because I healed too well, because my skill threatened those who thought they alone should possess medical knowledge. But I was no witch. I was simply a woman who learned from her grandmother, who studied every text she could find, who observed carefully and treated thoughtfully. That is not magic. That is medicine. I write this down so that someday, perhaps, the truth will be known. I vanished not by supernatural means but by human courage and cleverness. And I lived not to prove I had magical powers, but to continue the work of healing that I have always believed to be sacred. In gratitude and friendship. Dinah. Rachel sat in the Philadelphia archive, tears streaming down her face as she read Dinah's letter. This was it, the explanation for the impossible mystery. Dinah hadn't vanished by magic. She'd been rescued by one of the most daring escapes in colonial history. But as Rachel continued her research, she discovered something that made the story even more complex and troubling. The Thornton family, who'd owned Dinah and who'd pushed for her execution, had never accepted the explanation that she'd escaped. They'd maintained for generations that she'd vanished supernaturally, and they'd used that story to justify increasingly harsh treatment of other enslaved people on their plantation. If slaves can vanish by witchcraft, we must watch them more carefully, the Thorntons had argued. We must suppress any signs of African practices or unusual knowledge. The myth of Dinah's supernatural disappearance had been used to oppress other enslaved people for decades after her escape. And now, 280 years later, Rachel held the truth in her hands. But she also knew that revealing it would be controversial. Descendants of the Thornton family were still prominent in Virginia society. And the story challenged comfortable narratives about colonial America, about medicine, about race, about what enslaved people were capable of achieving. Rachel was preparing to publish her findings when she received a phone call that made her blood run cold. Dr. Morgan. This is Randall Thornton. I'm a descendant of the Thornton family of Williamsburg. I understand you've been researching our family's history. I'd like to discuss what you found before you publish anything. His voice was polite, but Rachel heard the threat underneath. Mr. Thornton, I'm conducting academic research. I don't need permission from families to publish historical findings. Of course not. But Dr. Morgan, the Thornton family has a reputation to protect. We've donated millions to Virginia institutions. We have close relationships with universities, museums, and historical societies. It would be unfortunate if your career were to suffer because you chose to publish sensational claims about a long-dead slave woman. Are you threatening me, Mr. Thornton? I'm simply pointing out realities. The story you're researching, about Dinah vanishing supernaturally, is family lore. It's an interesting tale, but it's not something that should be treated as serious history. If you publish claims that our ancestors persecuted an innocent woman, that they tried to burn a healer alive, that makes the Thornton family look cruel and ignorant. I'm sure you understand why we wouldn't want that narrative to spread. But it's true. I have documentation, court records, letters, Dinah's own testimony. Your family did try to execute her for the crime of healing people. You have papers that someone claims came from our family. You have stories written by people long dead. You have no way to verify any of it conclusively. And even if it is true, is it really necessary to damage living people's reputations over events that happened 280 years ago? Rachel felt anger rising in her chest. Dinah's story deserves to be told. She was a brilliant healer who saved lives and who was nearly murdered for her knowledge and skill. She represents countless enslaved people whose achievements have been erased from history. I'm not going to suppress the truth because it makes your family uncomfortable. Then you're making a mistake, Dr. Morgan. A career-ending mistake. The line went dead. Rachel sat for a long time, thinking about what she was about to face. Publishing this research would likely mean a fight, legal threats, professional attacks, efforts to discredit her work. The Thornton family had money and influence. They could make her life very difficult. But she thought about Dinah, standing in that courtroom in 1743, refusing to deny her healing abilities even though it meant a death sentence. She thought about Dinah living in Philadelphia for 46 years, training other healers, ensuring her knowledge would survive. And she thought about all the enslaved healers whose names had been forgotten, whose skills had been called witchcraft, whose achievements had been erased by people who couldn't accept that black people possessed sophisticated knowledge. Rachel opened her laptop and began writing. The title of her paper was, "The Impossible Mystery of Dinah, Medicine, Race, and the Witch Trial of a Colonial Healer." The truth was coming out. And this time, it would not vanish into silence. Rachel's paper was accepted by the Journal of American Medical History 2 months later, after rigorous peer review by 3 prominent historians. All 3 reviewers praised her meticulous documentation and careful analysis. The paper was scheduled for publication in the spring issue. But Randall Thornton made good on his threat. Before the paper could be published, Rachel received a letter from attorneys representing the Thornton family. They claimed Rachel's research was defamatory to their ancestors and demanded she withdraw the paper from publication. Rachel's university provided legal counsel, and the attorneys determined the Thornton family had no legitimate grounds to stop publication. Historical research about long-dead people, backed by documented evidence, was protected speech. The paper would be published as scheduled. But the Thornton family had other ways to fight back. They began a quiet campaign to damage Rachel's reputation in academic circles. They contacted donors to her university suggesting that Rachel's work was activist history, rather than legitimate scholarship. They spoke to colleagues in her field, casting doubt on her methods and motivations. Rachel felt the effects immediately. Conference invitations were withdrawn. Collaborative projects fell through. Her department chair called her in for an uncomfortable conversation about maintaining professional relationships and not alienating important donors. The message was clear: telling uncomfortable truths about powerful families' histories came with professional consequences. Rachel was considering whether to fight or to step back when she received an email that changed everything. It was from a woman named Dr. Imani Jackson, a professor of African American Studies at Howard University. Dr. Morgan. I read a pre-publication copy of your paper on Dinah, provided by a colleague who peer-reviewed it. Your work is extraordinary, and I believe I have information that will deepen your research significantly. My own family history includes a healer named Dinah who lived in Philadelphia in the late 1700s. We've always been told she was remarkable, that she'd escaped from slavery in Virginia, that she'd saved countless lives, that she'd trained several generations of healers in our community. But we never knew the full story of how she escaped or what had happened to her in Virginia. Your paper fills in the missing pieces of my family history. Dr. Morgan, I believe I am one of Dinah's descendants. And I have documents that have been in our family for generations, including what we believe is Dinah's personal medical journal, covering her entire life from Virginia through her years in Philadelphia. I'd like to share these materials with you, and I'd like to collaborate on expanding your research. Together, we can tell Dinah's complete story, not just her trial and escape, but her entire life's work. And we can do it with the backing of Howard University and other institutions that will support this work regardless of what the Thornton family thinks. Would you be willing to meet? Dr. Imani Jackson. Rachel traveled to Washington, D.C. the following week. Dr. Jackson was in her 50s, warm and passionate about her work, and she'd brought materials that made Rachel's breath catch. The medical journal was extraordinary, over 300 pages of detailed notes spanning from 1738, when Dinah was around 20 years old, to 1788, a year before her death. The entries covered hundreds of cases, detailed observations about diseases, notes on herbal treatments and their effects, and reflections on the practice of healing. This has been in my family's possession since Dinah died, Imani explained. It was passed down through the family line she established in Philadelphia. My great-great-great-grandmother was one of her students. She inherited the journal and kept it safe, passing it down with instructions to preserve it because someday people will understand how important this knowledge is. Rachel carefully examined the journal. Early entries from Virginia showed Dinah treating enslaved people and poor whites who couldn't afford physicians. The cases were documented with remarkable clinical precision. Patient, Sarah, age 34, enslaved at the Morrison plantation. Symptoms: severe pain during monthly courses, heavy bleeding, extreme fatigue. Duration: 2 years, worsening recently. Examination revealed a mass in her womb, hard and irregular. I fear this is a cancer that will kill her within the year. There is no treatment I know that will cure it, only herbs that will ease her pain as the disease progresses. Treatment: gave her tinctures of poppy and valerian for pain. Taught her to use heat compresses for cramping. Told her family to keep her comfortable and let her rest as much as Master Morrison will allow. Note: Master Morrison says Sarah must continue working. He does not believe she is truly ill. This is the cruelty of slavery, that even dying women must work until they collapse. I can ease her pain, but I cannot give her the rest and care she needs to die with dignity. Rachel felt tears in her eyes as she read entry after entry showing Dinah's skill, compassion, and frustration with a system that treated sick people as property that must be worked until it broke. But the journal also showed something else: Dinah's gradual realization that her knowledge made her dangerous. An entry from November 1742. Dr. Hartley refused to lend me more medical books today. He says it is inappropriate for a slave to have such knowledge. I see in his eyes not just prejudice but fear. He fears that I know as much as he does. He fears that patients will prefer my treatments to his. He fears that a black woman's skill exposes the lie that we are inferior to white people. This is the danger I face. Each person I heal successfully makes physicians look incompetent. Each time I diagnose a condition they've missed, I threaten their authority. They will not tolerate this for long. I am considering what to do. Part of me wants to stop healing, to protect myself. But I cannot turn away from sick people who need help. My grandmother taught me that healing is sacred work, that knowledge of medicine is a gift that must be used to serve others. How can I honor her memory if I hide my abilities to protect myself? I will continue to heal. And I will prepare for the consequences. The journal showed that Dinah had anticipated her arrest. She begun making plans for escape months before she was formally accused. An entry from August 1743. I made contact today with a Quaker man who visits Williamsburg occasionally on business. I had heard that Quakers oppose slavery and sometimes help enslaved people escape. I approached him carefully, treating a wound on his hand, and while I worked I mentioned that I knew of a healer who needed to travel north for safety. He understood what I was really asking. He said he knew people who might be able to help. He gave me no details, safer for both of us if I know nothing until necessary, but he said if I ever needed urgent assistance, I should leave a red ribbon tied to the fence behind the Thornton house. I now have a plan. If they arrest me, if they try to burn me, I will not die without a fight. Imani watched Rachel read, seeing the younger scholars' growing excitement. This journal changes everything, doesn't it? It shows that Dinah wasn't just a victim who got lucky. She was someone who understood the danger she was in and who actively planned her own rescue. It shows more than that, Rachel said. It shows that enslaved people were strategic, intelligent, and capable of sophisticated long-term planning. It completely contradicts the historical narrative that enslaved people were passive victims who needed white abolitionists to save them. Dinah saved herself, with help from allies, yes, but ultimately through her own courage and planning. The journal's final entry about the escape was detailed and chilling. December 1st, 1743, they brought me to the square. They bound me to the stake. The crowd gathered, hundreds of people, some weeping for me, others calling for my death. I looked for the signal that my rescue was prepared, but I saw nothing. I began to think I would truly burn. Then I saw him, the Quaker man, standing in the crowd with 2 others I didn't recognize. He nodded once, slightly. The signal. The magistrate gave the order. They lit the fire. Flames rose around me. The heat was terrible. For a moment I thought the rescue would come too late, that I would burn before I could escape. Then smoke, thick, black smoke that blinded the crowd. I heard coughing and shouting. In that moment, I broke the weakened ropes. They had been treated with something that made them brittle. I dropped through the hollow beneath the pyre, crawling through darkness and dirt, my lungs burning from smoke, my skin scorched from flames. Hands grabbed me at the end of the tunnel, the 3 men from the crowd. They pulled me into a wagon covered with hay. Someone threw a dress over me. The wagon began to move while behind us I could hear screaming and chaos. I wanted to stay conscious, to see where they were taking me, but the smoke and the terror and the burns overwhelmed me. I passed out. When I woke, I was in a barn somewhere north of Williamsburg. A Quaker woman was tending my burns with cool cloths. She smiled when she saw I was awake and said, "Welcome to your new life, friend. I am alive. I am free. And I will never forget what they tried to do to me." Rachel and Imani spent the next 3 months working together, combining Rachel's research on the trial with Imani's family materials about Dinah's life in Philadelphia. They discovered that Dinah had lived for 46 years after her escape, training over 60 students in her healing methods, treating thousands of patients, and essentially establishing the first nursing and midwifery training program in Philadelphia. They also found that Dinah had tried to maintain contact with people she'd left behind in Virginia, enslaved people she'd cared about and wanted to help. The journal entries from her Philadelphia years showed her continuing to coordinate with Underground Railroad networks, providing medical training to conductors who could help wounded or sick escapees, and sending money south to purchase the freedom of people she'd known. An entry from 1750. Received word today that Moses, who I treated for consumption in Virginia, successfully escaped and is now in New York. He sent word thanking me for keeping him alive long enough to make the journey north. This is why I escaped, not just to save myself, but to continue helping others from a position of safety. I have trained 12 students now in Philadelphia. Each one will go on to heal hundreds. The knowledge my grandmother gave me, the knowledge I gained from stolen books and careful observation, will spread and multiply. This is my revenge against those who tried to burn me. I will create a network of healers that will save more lives than they can ever take. But Rachel and Imani also discovered something troubling. The Thornton family had indeed used the myth of Dinah's supernatural disappearance to justify increased oppression of enslaved people on their plantation and in Virginia generally. They found documents showing that in the years after 1743, Virginia passed increasingly strict laws against enslaved people learning to read, practicing any kind of healing or medicine, or gathering in groups. The preamble to one such law specifically mentioned the danger posed by slaves who acquire unnatural knowledge or abilities that threaten the good order of society. They used Dinah's escape to make things worse for other enslaved people, Imani said, her voice tight with anger. They used her intelligence and skill as an excuse to suppress other black people's ability to learn and excel. Which is exactly why the true story needs to be told, Rachel replied. Not the myth of supernatural disappearance, but the truth, that Dinah was a brilliant healer who was persecuted for her knowledge and who escaped through courage and careful planning. That's the story that honors her and that corrects the historical record. They completed their collaborative paper, now expanded into a book-length manuscript titled Dinah, Medicine, Race, and Freedom in Colonial America, and submitted it to several publishers. 3 expressed immediate interest, seeing both the scholarly merit and the commercial potential of the story. But before they could finalize a publishing deal, Rachel received another threatening letter from the Thornton family's attorneys. This time, they claimed that the journal Imani possessed was actually stolen property that had belonged to the Thornton family and should be returned to them. The legal claim was absurd. Dinah's personal journal couldn't have belonged to her enslavers, but it was clearly an attempt to intimidate and delay publication. Rachel and Imani held a press conference to address the threat directly. They stood together at Howard University, with the medical journal displayed in a protective case, and told reporters about their research and the legal intimidation they were facing. The Thornton family is trying to suppress this history because it makes their ancestors look bad, Imani said firmly. They want to maintain the myth that Dinah was a witch who vanished supernaturally, because that myth supports a narrative of black people as mysterious and dangerous. They don't want you to know the truth, that Dinah was a highly educated healer who was nearly murdered for her knowledge and who escaped through intelligence and courage. This journal belongs to Dinah's descendants, Rachel added. It belongs to Dr. Jackson's family, who have preserved it for 7 generations. It belongs to the historical record. And it belongs to everyone who wants to understand the true history of medicine, race, and resistance in colonial America. The Thornton family has no claim to it, legally or morally. The press conference generated significant media attention. News outlets across the country covered the story, framing it as a battle between historians trying to tell the truth and wealthy families trying to suppress uncomfortable history. Public opinion was overwhelmingly on Rachel and Imani's side. Social media exploded with support for their work and criticism of the Thornton family's attempts at intimidation. Within a week, the Thornton family's attorneys sent a terse message withdrawing their legal claims. But Randall Thornton wasn't finished. He gave interviews to conservative media outlets, claiming that Rachel and Imani were promoting divisive history that was designed to make white Americans feel guilty about slavery. This isn't about truth, Thornton told one interviewer. This is about activists disguised as historians, trying to turn historical figures into heroes of their political movement. They're taking a slave woman who was involved in folk medicine and turning her into some kind of medical genius and freedom fighter. It's absurd and it's offensive. Rachel responded in her own interview with a major newspaper, "What's offensive is erasing Dinah's real achievements because they challenge comfortable narratives. The historical record is clear, Dinah possessed sophisticated medical knowledge, she healed dozens of people successfully, and she escaped execution through a carefully planned rescue. These are facts, not politics. And the fact that those facts make some people uncomfortable doesn't make them less true." The book was published in October 2024, almost exactly 281 years after Dinah's dramatic escape. Dinah, Medicine, Race, and Freedom in Colonial America became an immediate bestseller. It was taught in university courses, discussed on podcasts and news programs, and sparked a broader conversation about hidden history and whose stories get told. But the most meaningful response came from ordinary people, particularly black women in medical fields, who saw themselves in Dinah's story. Rachel received hundreds of emails and messages from nurses, doctors, midwives, and other healthcare professionals talking about how Dinah's story resonated with them. Many described facing similar challenges, having their knowledge questioned, being underestimated because of their race and gender, fighting for respect in medical systems that weren't designed for them. One email particularly moved Rachel. It was from a black woman named Dr. Jasmine Williams, an emergency room physician in Atlanta. "Dr. Morgan. I just finished reading your book about Dinah. I stayed up all night reading it, crying through most of it, because I saw myself in her story. I'm an ER doctor. I'm good at my job, really good. But there are still patients who don't want me to treat them because I'm black. There are still colleagues who question my diagnoses or second-guess my decisions in ways they don't do with white doctors. There are still moments when I walk into a room and people assume I'm a nurse or a technician, not a physician." Reading about Dinah, about how she was called a witch because she healed people too effectively, about how her knowledge threatened people who thought black women couldn't be skilled healers, it helped me understand that this is not a new problem. Black women have been fighting for recognition of their medical expertise for centuries. But Dinah's story also gave me hope. Because she didn't let them silence her. She kept healing. She kept teaching. She escaped when they tried to kill her, and she built a new life where she trained a generation of healers. She turned her oppression into a legacy of healing that lasted long after her oppressors died. That's what I'm trying to do too. I heal my patients. I mentor young black women in medicine. And someday, maybe my story will inspire someone else the way Dinah's story has inspired me. Thank you for bringing her story to light. Thank you for fighting to tell the truth. It matters more than you know. Rachel shared this email with Imani, and both women felt their work validated in a way that academic accolades could never provide. But they knew the work wasn't finished. Dinah's story was told, but there were countless other stories like hers that remained hidden, stories of enslaved healers, scholars, inventors, and organizers whose achievements had been erased or minimized. They decided to create a research project dedicated to finding and documenting these hidden stories. They secured funding from foundations interested in supporting overlooked histories. And they began training graduate students to conduct the kind of archival research that had uncovered Dinah's story. 6 months after their book was published, Rachel and Imani returned to Williamsburg, Virginia, the town where Dinah had been tried and nearly executed. They'd been invited to give a public lecture at the College of William and Mary about their research. Standing in a packed auditorium just blocks from where Dinah's trial had been held, Rachel and Imani told her story to hundreds of people. They showed slides of the historical documents, read passages from Dinah's journal, and explained how the myth of her supernatural disappearance had been used to oppress other enslaved people for decades. Dinah was called a witch because her medical knowledge threatened the social order, Imani explained. She was an enslaved black woman who knew more than trained white physicians. That reality was unacceptable to colonial society. So rather than acknowledging her skill, they called it witchcraft. Rather than learning from her, they tried to burn her. But Dinah refused to be silenced, Rachel continued. She escaped through courage and careful planning. She rebuilt her life in Philadelphia. She trained dozens of students. She healed thousands of people. And she left behind a journal documenting her work so that someday, somehow, the truth would be known. After the lecture, an elderly white woman approached them. She was in her 80s, elegantly dressed, and she introduced herself as Margaret Thornton. "I'm Randall's aunt," she said quietly. "And I want to apologize for my family's behavior. Randall was wrong to threaten you. Wrong to try to suppress your research. Wrong to defend ancestors who tried to murder an innocent woman." She pulled out an old photograph. "This was my mother. She taught me that you can love your family while still acknowledging their sins. She taught me that being proud of your heritage doesn't mean lying about its ugly parts. I've read your book. It's honest and fair. And Dinah's story deserves to be told, regardless of how it reflects on my family." Margaret handed them an envelope. "These are copies of some additional Thornton family papers I found in my attic. Letters about Dinah from after her escape. I think they'll be useful for your research. And I want you to know that not all of us are like Randall. Some of us believe the truth matters more than family pride." Rachel and Imani thanked her, moved by this unexpected gesture. The letters Margaret provided would indeed be valuable. They showed how the Thornton family had struggled with the embarrassment of having been deceived so completely by an enslaved woman, and how they tried to reshape the narrative to protect their reputation. As Rachel and Imani drove back to Washington that evening, they reflected on how far the story had come, from hidden family secrets and historical mysteries to published research and public recognition. "Dinah would be proud," Imani said. "Not just that her story is known, but that we're using it to inspire more research, to train more scholars, to uncover more hidden histories." She turned her persecution into a legacy of healing, Rachel agreed. "We're turning her hidden story into a tool for historical justice. It feels like the right way to honor her." But they also knew that challenges remained. The Thornton family's resistance had been overcome, but there would be other families, other institutions, other people who didn't want uncomfortable histories revealed. Every hidden story would require its own fight. They were ready for those fights. Because Dinah had taught them something important, that truth matters, that knowledge is power, and that even the most determined efforts to silence people ultimately fail. The witch slave who healed 33 people and then vanished had finally been found. Not through magic, but through historical research, family preservation of documents, and scholars willing to fight for truth. And her story would never be hidden again. The success of the book sparked something unexpected, a movement to recognize and honor other hidden medical pioneers from the slavery era. Historians across the country began searching archives for evidence of enslaved healers, midwives, and medical practitioners whose work had been erased from history. Within a year of Dinah, Medicine, Race, and Freedom in Colonial America being published, researchers had documented over 40 cases of enslaved people with sophisticated medical knowledge who'd been persecuted, accused of witchcraft, or had their achievements attributed to their enslavers. But in December 2025, Rachel received a phone call that suggested Dinah's story was even more remarkable than they'd realized. Dr. Morgan. My name is Professor Catherine Reynolds. I teach at Cambridge University in England. I've been researching the history of African medical knowledge that was brought to the Americas during the slave trade. I believe I've found evidence of Dinah's grandmother, the woman who taught her healing. Rachel's heart raced. You found her grandmother? In Africa? Not exactly. In Caribbean records. I found evidence that a woman named Adise, which means princess or daughter of the king, in Igbo, was captured in what is now Nigeria around 1690 and brought to Barbados. Ship records describe her as an African woman of noble bearing who claims knowledge of healing. She was in Barbados for about 15 years before being sold to Virginia. Catherine sent Rachel her research files. The evidence was compelling. Plantation records from Barbados showed that Adise had been consulted by white plantation owners and even white doctors for difficult medical cases. One doctor's journal from 1702 described her as possessing knowledge of anatomy and disease that rivals European medical training, though she claims to have learned it in her homeland. African medical traditions were incredibly sophisticated, Catherine explained when they spoke again. But European colonizers couldn't accept that. They either dismissed African medical knowledge as superstition, or they appropriated it without crediting its source. Adise's knowledge was probably based in advanced Igbo medical traditions that had been developed over centuries. She would have been trained in her homeland, possibly as a healer or medical practitioner of high status. Rachel began connecting the pieces. Dinah's grandmother had been an African-trained medical practitioner who'd been enslaved and brought to the Caribbean, then Virginia. She'd taught her daughter, Dinah's mother, what she could, and that daughter had taught Dinah. The medical knowledge that colonial Virginians called witchcraft was actually advanced African medical practice combined with whatever European knowledge Dinah could acquire through books. This realization led Rachel and Imani to expand their research again. They began investigating the African origins of medical knowledge that enslaved people had brought to the Americas, and how that knowledge had been suppressed, appropriated, or dismissed as superstition. What they found was staggering. Enslaved Africans had introduced to the Americas sophisticated techniques for treating smallpox, herbal remedies that would later be incorporated into Western pharmacology, surgical techniques, and advanced understanding of anatomy and disease. But because this knowledge came from black people, and particularly from enslaved people, it was rarely credited or properly documented. Dinah's story isn't just about one remarkable woman, Imani said during a research meeting. It's about centuries of African medical knowledge that was erased or stolen. Every time a plantation owner claimed credit for a medical treatment that came from enslaved healers, every time a white doctor dismissed African techniques as primitive before appropriating them, that was theft. Intellectual and cultural theft on a massive scale. They decided to address this in a second book, focused on the broader context of African medical knowledge in colonial America. But before they could begin serious work on it, Rachel received another phone call that would change their research direction again. "Dr. Morgan, my name is Thomas Jefferson Davis. I'm 92 years old, and I'm calling from a hospice in Richmond, Virginia. I don't have much time left, but I need to tell you something about Dinah before I die." Thomas explained that he was a descendant of one of the Quaker men who'd helped rescue Dinah from execution. His family had maintained records of Underground Railroad activities, kept secret for generations to protect the people involved. "My great-great-great-grandfather was named Jacob Harrison. He was one of the 3 men who created the smoke screen that allowed Dinah to escape. He kept a diary of his Underground Railroad work. It's been in our family's possession for over 280 years. I'm donating it to the Virginia Historical Society, but I wanted you to see it first. There's something in it about Dinah that I think you need to know." Thomas sent Rachel scans of the diary. And in it, she found an entry that completely changed her understanding of Dinah's impact. "June 17, 1760, 17 years since we rescued Dinah from the burning. I received word today from Philadelphia that our friend has trained her 50th student in healing arts. Each of these students will go on to train others, spreading the knowledge that authorities tried to destroy by burning her. But there is more to report, something Dinah shared with me in confidence during my recent visit. She has been working with other Quaker friends to establish a secret network of medical training for black healers throughout the colonies. She teaches not only healing techniques but also how to document medical knowledge, how to pass it on despite laws against teaching enslaved people, and how to operate carefully enough to avoid accusations of witchcraft. Dinah calls this network the Grandmother's Legacy, in honor of the African grandmother who taught her. She believes that medical knowledge should belong to everyone, not just to white physicians and their elite institutions. She is determined to ensure that black communities have skilled healers who can serve them, since white doctors so often refuse to treat enslaved people or free blacks properly. I am in awe of what she has built from the ashes of her persecution. They tried to burn her for healing 33 people. She has now trained 50 healers who will heal thousands. This is how good triumphs over evil, not through violence or revenge, but through building something that cannot be destroyed." Rachel called Imani immediately. She didn't just survive and start healing again. She created an entire training network. A secret medical school for black healers that operated throughout the colonies for decades. Over the next months, Rachel and Imani tracked the influence of the Grandmother's Legacy. They found evidence of trained black healers operating in Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Charleston, and other major cities throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s. Many of these healers could be traced back to training by either Dinah or her students. They found testimony from formerly enslaved people describing how underground networks of black healers had kept them alive when white doctors refused to treat them. They found evidence of medical knowledge being passed down through families in secret, with grandmothers teaching granddaughters the same healing techniques that had originated in Africa and been preserved through generations of enslavement. Dinah didn't just save herself, Imani said as they compiled their findings. She created a legacy that saved thousands of people over multiple generations. The Grandmother's Legacy, that network she built, was essentially the foundation of black medical practice in America. It filled the gap left by a white medical establishment that refused to serve black communities. But they also found evidence that authorities had occasionally discovered and attacked these networks. Multiple black healers had been accused of witchcraft or illegal medical practice in the decades following Dinah's escape. Some had been jailed, fined, or driven from their communities. The persecution Dinah had escaped was part of a broader pattern of suppressing black medical knowledge. Rachel and Imani's second book, The Grandmother's Legacy, African Medical Knowledge in Colonial America, was published in 2027. It traced the networks of black healers that Dinah had helped establish, documented the African origins of much of their knowledge, and exposed how systematically that knowledge had been suppressed and stolen. The book prompted medical schools across the country to examine their own histories. Several prestigious institutions discovered that their founders had worked with or learned from black healers without giving them credit. Some began initiatives to acknowledge these hidden contributors to medical knowledge. But the most profound impact was on the black medical community itself. Organizations representing black doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals embraced Dinah's story as part of their professional heritage. Medical schools serving black communities began teaching about the grandmother's legacy as part of their history curriculum. And in Philadelphia, on the site where Dinah's school had stood in the 1700s, the city erected a memorial. The dedication ceremony in 2028 brought together descendants of people Dinah had healed, descendants of her students, medical professionals, historians, and community members. Imani spoke at the dedication, her voice strong with emotion. "We stand here today to honor a woman who was mocked as a witch, who was sentenced to burn, who vanished from history for nearly 300 years. But Dinah wasn't a witch. She was a healer, a teacher, and a revolutionary. She took knowledge that had been passed down from her African grandmother through generations of enslavement, combined it with European medical learning she acquired through determination and courage, and used it all to save lives. When they tried to kill her for healing too well, she escaped. And then she did something even more remarkable. She built a network that would ensure black communities had access to skilled healers for generations. The grandmother's legacy trained hundreds of healers who treated thousands of patients. That legacy continues today in every black healthcare professional who fights to serve their community despite systemic barriers. Dinah was underestimated because she was black, because she was a woman, because she was enslaved. They thought they could control her, own her, and ultimately destroy her. They were wrong on every count. She was smarter, braver, and more determined than they could imagine. And she won, not through magic or supernatural power, but through knowledge, courage, and an unbreakable commitment to healing. Rachel spoke next, addressing the crowd of hundreds. 5 years ago, I discovered documents about a slave woman who'd been accused of witchcraft and had mysteriously vanished before her execution. It seemed like an impossible mystery, something that couldn't be explained, couldn't be verified, couldn't be understood. But through careful research, through partnership with Dr. Jackson and other scholars, through the courage of descendants who preserved family records for generations, we solved the mystery. Dinah didn't vanish by magic. She escaped through one of the most daring rescues in colonial American history. And then she lived for 46 more years, healing and teaching and building a legacy that has impacted millions of lives. The real mystery wasn't how she disappeared. The real mystery is why her story was hidden for so long. Why did it take 280 years for the truth to come out? And the answer to that mystery is uncomfortable but important. Her story was hidden because it challenged narratives that powerful people wanted to maintain. They wanted to believe enslaved people were inferior and incapable of sophisticated knowledge. They wanted to believe that European medicine was superior to African healing traditions. They wanted to believe that black women couldn't be skilled medical practitioners. Dinah's truth contradicted all those beliefs. So her truth was suppressed, minimized, and nearly lost forever. But truth has a way of surviving. It was preserved in family stories and hidden documents. It was protected by descendants who knew it mattered even when they didn't know the full story. And eventually, it came to light. After the speeches, the memorial was unveiled, a bronze statue of Dinah, shown not in chains or in suffering, but standing tall and proud, holding healing herbs in one hand and a medical text in the other. The plaque read, Dinah, circa 1718 to 1789. Healer, teacher, freedom fighter ***. They called her a witch for healing too well. They sentenced her to burn. She escaped, survived, and spent 46 years. building a legacy of healing that saved thousands. Her knowledge came from African ancestors, was preserved through enslavement, was nearly destroyed by persecution, but ultimately triumphed over those who tried to silence her. The grandmother's legacy lives on. In every healer who serves their community. In every teacher who passes on knowledge. In everyone who refuses to let truth be buried. Among the crowd at the dedication was Margaret Thornton, the elderly Thornton family member who'd supported Rachel and Imani's research. She approached them after the ceremony, tears in her eyes. "I'm glad this memorial exists," she said quietly. "I'm glad Dinah is finally being honored. And I'm sorry, so deeply sorry, for what my ancestors tried to do to her. They were on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of morality, and the wrong side of common human decency. I can't change what they did. But I can acknowledge it and work to ensure their victims are remembered and honored." She handed Rachel and Imani a check, a substantial donation to establish a scholarship fund for black students pursuing medical careers. "This is from the Thornton family, at least, from those of us who believe in facing history honestly. It doesn't undo the past. But maybe it can help build a better future." The scholarship fund was named the Dinah Fellowship and would support dozens of black medical students over the coming years. As the dedication ceremony concluded, Rachel and Imani stood together looking at the memorial statue. They thought about the journey that had brought them here, from Rachel's initial discovery of documents about a mysterious witch trial, through months of research and legal battles, through the publication of 2 books and the uncovering of a vast network of hidden history. "We did it," Imani said softly. "We solved the impossible mystery. We brought Dinah's story to light. We honored her legacy. And we changed how people understand this history," Rachel added. "We showed that enslaved people weren't passive victims. We showed that African medical knowledge was sophisticated and valuable. We showed that women like Dinah were heroes who fought against their oppression with intelligence and courage." They received one more meaningful message that evening, an email from Dr. Jasmine Williams, the ER doctor who'd written to Rachel years earlier about how Dinah's story had inspired her. "Dr. Morgan and Dr. Jackson. I attended the memorial dedication today. Standing in front of that statue, seeing Dinah honored as a healer and teacher and freedom fighter, I felt something shift inside me. For my entire medical career, I've dealt with people underestimating me because I'm a black woman. I've been called angry when I advocate firmly for my patients. I've been questioned when I make diagnoses that turn out to be correct. I've been excluded from opportunities because I don't fit with the traditional image of what a doctor should be. Learning about Dinah helped me understand that this is a very old pattern. Black women healers have been persecuted, dismissed, and attacked for centuries because our knowledge and competence threatens people who think medicine belongs only to white men. But seeing her memorial today, seeing her honored and remembered, seeing her legacy acknowledged, it made me realize that we're winning. Slowly, painfully, but we're winning. Truth is coming out. Hidden histories are being revealed. And women like Dinah are finally getting the recognition they deserved all along. I'm no longer ashamed or apologetic about my competence. I'm no longer trying to make myself smaller so others feel comfortable. I'm standing tall, like Dinah in that statue, and claiming my place as a healer. And I'm teaching the next generation of black women in medicine to do the same. Thank you for bringing Dinah's story to light. Thank you for fighting to tell the truth. You've changed my life and the lives of countless others who needed to know that we come from a long line of brilliant, courageous healers who refuse to be silenced. With gratitude and admiration. Dr. Jasmine Williams. Rachel and Imani read the email together, both crying by the end. "This is why we do this work," Imani said. "Not for academic recognition or book sales, but for moments like this. For people who need to know they come from greatness, who need to see themselves reflected in history, who need to understand that their struggles are part of a much longer fight. The story of Dinah, the witch slave who healed 33 people, was set to burn, and then vanished, had finally been fully told. The impossible mystery had been solved, not through supernatural explanations but through historical research, family preservation of records, and scholars willing to fight for truth. But more than solving a mystery, telling Dinah's story had sparked a movement. It had inspired more research into hidden histories. It had prompted medical institutions to acknowledge their debts to black healers. It had given current and future black medical professionals a heroic ancestor to claim and honor. And perhaps most importantly, it had proven that truth, no matter how long suppressed, eventually emerges. The powerful families and institutions that tried to keep Dinah's story hidden had ultimately failed. Justice, delayed by centuries, had finally been served. As Rachel and Imani left Philadelphia that evening, driving back to Washington under a clear November sky, they reflected on how far they'd come and how much work remained to be done. "There are more stories like Dinah's out there," Imani said. "More hidden histories waiting to be uncovered. More brilliant people who were erased from the record because they were black, because they were enslaved, because their achievements challenged comfortable narratives. And we're going to find them," Rachel replied with determination. "We're going to keep researching, keep writing, keep fighting to bring hidden truths to light. Because every story we uncover, every hero we honor, every lie we expose, it matters. It all matters." They drove on into the night, two scholars who devoted themselves to historical justice, carrying forward the legacy of a woman who'd risked everything to heal and teach and build a better future. The witch who'd been sentenced to burn had become a symbol of resistance, resilience, and the ultimate triumph of truth over oppression. Her story would never be hidden again. Asterisk author's note: this story is fiction, but it's inspired by very real historical patterns. During the colonial and slavery eras, black healers, particularly women, were often persecuted for possessing medical knowledge that threatened white authority. Many were accused of witchcraft or illegal medical practice. Some were executed. Many more had their knowledge stolen or dismissed as superstition, only to have it later appropriated by white medical professionals who claimed it as their own discovery. The sophisticated medical traditions of Africa were systematically devalued and erased, while African medical practitioners in the Americas fought to preserve and pass on their knowledge despite laws against teaching enslaved people and despite constant threats of persecution. This story honors those forgotten healers and the legacy they left behind, even when their names were never recorded in history books. Asterisk.